Welcome to our continuing series, Conversations with Contemplatives. Today we're going to be speaking with Ivonne and Chris Rose. Yeshe, Chödrön, and Zopa, Jigme are students of Yeshe and have been full-time practitioners of Tibetan Buddhism for over 20 years. Since 2005, they've been teaching and translating Dharma texts and oral teachings from Tibetan to English for the Rigpa Dorje Institute for International Students at Pulahari Monastery in Nepal. From 2013 to 2016, they received Sadra Foundation Scholarship to participate in the traditional Kagyu lineage 3-year cloistered retreat at Vajravidya Retreat Center in Crestone, Colorado, under the auspices of Chapje Trungpa Rinpoche. They're passionate about sharing traditional methods for transmitting experiential understanding of Buddha Dharma with Western students through Prajna Fire, their international Dharma community. Together, they co-host the popular Buddhist podcast, Prajna Sparks. So, Yeshe and Zopa, welcome. Nice to be able to speak with you in this series.
Thank you, Lama Drupal.
Thank you, Lama Drupal.
So, in this series, as I mentioned to you previously, we're trying to provide a window into the esoteric world of retreat and 3-year retreat for individuals who may not have had the opportunity or may be interested in such a training. And so let's begin a little bit about your pre-retreat life, what it looked like, what you were involved in, and where you heard about 3-year retreat and what inspired you to move towards entering 3-year retreat.
I mean, I think I would say probably what inspired me the most, if you go far enough back, is just the fact that life doesn't always work out the way you want it to. And there's a lot of discomfort and lack of fulfillment, even amidst the joys that we enjoy. So that drove me, like so many others, to a spiritual path, and in particular to the Buddha Dharma and the Tibetan expression of that. I was a lawyer in Silicon Valley in the early 2000s when the tech bubble burst, and I had the opportunity to continue my studies of Tibetan Buddhism at Pulahari Monastery in Nepal. So I left to do that, and then spent what I thought was going to be only 1 year turned into a decades-long adventure of studying Tibetan Buddhist philosophy and language, and training as a translator at Pulahari Monastery, and also in Meerut, India, with our root guru, Kyabje Rinpoche. So most of our pre-retreat training, I say our because I met Zopa my first year at Pulahari. He'd already been before. We spent a lot of time training in India and Nepal, doing the Ngo-dro practices, studying the seminal texts, the philosophy of the lineage, and mostly being in service to our teachers, which was just indispensable for training and everything, but in particular for a retreat, although we didn't know it at the time.
Yeah, I think the only thing that I'd add would just be that it, at least for me at first, there was several years of involvement of serious involvement in being over in Asia, in India and Nepal, working with teachers, doing the Ngo-dro practices like Yeshe mentioned, studying, where I definitely had the idea that I would not do 3-year retreat. I couldn't imagine, like, particularly the idea of like sleeping sitting up. I'm quite attached to my sleep, and so I was like, oh, that sounds too crazy. But I think it was after several years of more intensive like study and practice in Asia primarily. I think it was around 2003 that we started seriously contemplating it and approached Bokar Rinpoche about the possibility of doing it. And at that time, we had been aimed at doing a retreat in Oregon that at that time was supposed to start a couple of years, like in 2006, something like that. And so we're like, I don't know if we'll be able to make it, because we really wanted to finish the Pulahari program that they had going on at the time. But Bokar Rinpoche said, oh, no, it's fine. You can do both. We didn't know how it would work, but at that point we had some sense, like he knew a bit more than we did. So.
And where did you first hear about 3-year retreat? Where did that come into your awareness? Do you remember?
Mm-hmm. I think for me, it probably came into my awareness. I encountered Tibetan Buddhism in my teenage years, in my early teenage years, and with a couple of different lamas in the West here. And so I think I had a little bit of an idea about what went into it from the time I was a teenager. Although at that time I wasn't even inclined at all in that way. But I think going over on pilgrimage to India, Nepal, and Tibet kind of really hooked me and sparked my interest even more. How about you, Yeshe?
I think I must have heard about it for the first time through Western lamas who had done 3-year retreat, like you, Lama Drukgyal. I was studying at Chödrön Kunkyab in San Francisco, which is led by Lama Lodro Rinpoche. They had a very active program in 3-year retreat. And one of my formative teachers, Lama Jimpa, had done 3-year retreat with Kalo Rinpoche in the 80s. And I admired it very much, but I also thought it was absolutely insane and not something I would ever do. But as Zopa says, as I encountered the teachings more and more, and frankly, just became in love with the Buddha Dharma, it seemed like the ideal way to go deeper into the practice and study.
And so, as I think you've alluded to, the Oregon retreat took longer and longer and longer to get off the ground. And so in the end, you chose to do retreat in Crestone.
Yeah, and it was funny because we felt a very strong connection to the Oregon retreat through KCC, partially because of the Sangha, because it felt we were so familiar with so many of the people through the close connection under Boka Rinpoche and Boka Rinpoche's Mahamudra program and Yidam program that he did. And so we were really aimed at doing it there for a while. But then things just fell together for us to do it at Vajravidya. We ongoing teaching and translating at Pulahari Monastery, and it just felt, when we heard about the Vajravidya Khenpo Jigme, we had already had some connection with Khenpo Jigme, having translated for him a couple times, and the idea of being able to keep using our Tibetan quite intensively, as well as just the very traditional structure that Khenpo Jigme said he wanted to follow, in terms of keeping it very similar to what the monks in Bhaktapur at Trungpa Rinpoche's retreat center there in Nepal, the same schedule and so forth. It just felt very like a good fit to us, as well as really good timing. We had been getting a little bit impatient, waiting for the Oregon retreat to get up and running. So,
which finally did get up and running some years later. I forget the exact dates, but it was after that. So then you arrived in Crestone. So let's talk a little bit about the actual retreat setup, how that was for you, the experiences there, the kind of what worked, what I remember there were some issues a little bit. The setup was a little bit non-traditional. Separate cloistered building. It was kind of in the main building. Anyway, talk to us about that.
Yeah, it was interesting because one of the reasons we were so plugged into the Oregon Center was because Boka Rinpoche had been so involved in the structure and how it would be set up, and he was very careful. He wanted to honor the different wings for male identified and female identified people, and we were very much wanting to do that. We really appreciated Khenpo Jigme's very traditional approach, but it was impossible to have a segregated retreat. The retreat building had been started, was going to be built as a traditional 2-wing center for 3-year retreat. But along the way, the funding issues arose, and there was only one wing, so it was impossible to segregate genders. And frankly, the first hurdle we had was, I don't want to go to a retreat with him. By that point, we'd been together for 10 years, and we were kind of a unit. And I think we were both really appreciating having some space where we could be ourselves individually. So that took a while to get over, but the other things we mentioned made it really worthwhile. It's basically in our backyard. We live in Santa Fe, New Mexico, so it's 5 hours away. And you can Jigme very well as also. But once we got over that hurdle, honestly, I don't think it took me half a day of retreat to be grateful that Zopa was there. Because there's just so many challenges. And you mentioned that there were some unconventional structures. Trungpa Rinpoche had wanted to make the retreat experience available for people who were really ready to do this, but for one reason or another couldn't commit to the cloister setting. So we and a few others were cloistered in the retreat building, but then there were also additional folks who were, we were calling them off-site. They were following the retreat curriculum to the best of their ability, and each one had individual circumstances that they'd worked out with Rinpoche. But for one reason or another, they couldn't be cloistered. And so there was this kind of hybrid situation. I can use hybrid now that we're post-pandemic. I don't think we ever used that word before, but it was a hybrid. There were 5 of us at the beginning who were cloistered, and about, I think, 6 or 7 who were off-site, some right in Crestone and some farther away. So that was unusual, because usually when you're cloistered, you don't have anybody coming into the cloistered space. We also had the teachers living with us, which is not that unusual, but the cooks also did not have separate housing. The cooks were living in the cloister as well. So that was also a very unusual structure. Wouldn't you say, Zopa?
Yeah, it was. And it took us, for sure, it took us a little bit to get used to that, because we were very gung-ho. We had prepared quite a bit at that point, learning Tibetan and having completed a couple of Ngo-dro and all of the service that we felt was such an important part of our path, the service to the monastery or helping with Kagyu Manlam in India. And so all of that felt like a lot of preparation. And by that point, since we had been aimed at 3-year retreat then for almost 10 years, by the time we started, it felt like it was like the most important thing. We were so focused on really getting the most out of the retreat that we could. And I think a large part of that was just steeped in our respect for the tradition, in our respect, and having experienced on multiple occasions that we have our own ideas about how things should go. And all those times working for Pulahari or Kagyu Manlam or things like that, where we had ideas about how things should go, and then the monastery would do something a different way, and we'd have resistance, and we'd dig in our heels a little bit, and then it worked out much better the way the monastery had planned to do it. So kind of having a little bit of humility from that experience in some ways built up this sense of trusting very strongly the tradition, trusting the wisdom of things that might seem to our Western mind, Western logic, not as efficient or good or things like that, but really having come to respect that a lot more and respect the inner movement that can produce. So going into retreat, we were quite, we had that humility on one hand, but then on the other hand, we also were quite firmly adhering to the idea, like, okay, it's got to be traditional in the way And there was certainly were challenges with that. I mean, the retreat, the Vajravidya, they had have a sangha, a pretty committed sangha up there in Crestone, Colorado, and so they still had people coming into the shrine room to do their morning practices while we were up in our own individual rooms doing our morning practices. So it's not that we would see people, but although every once in a while someone did wander into the retreat for one reason or another. And so there certainly was some challenges with that, but I think for both Yeshe and myself, we are just so grateful to Khenpo Jigme and Khenpo Lobsang for handling all of us with care, for really being so dedicated to trying to balance all of the different people that come into 3-year retreat. And I think that's, for me, that's one of the biggest things that happens in 3-year retreat is, we're used to, as children, we have to live under our parents' rules with siblings that we may or may not get along with, these kind of things. But as we get older, we're like, okay, I live on my own, I have my own choices, that kind of thing. And then having a whole bunch of adults come together and live in a way that's not really democratic, right? It's not supposed to be democratic. But it can be quite challenging, especially, I feel like I think it can be challenging to anybody, but especially to our Western individualistic mindset, it can be hard. And that's part of the practice.
One of the things we'll talk about a little bit later is the whole adaptation challenges that we're all kind of facing and engaged in and thinking about. And probably we'd have to say that even from the very first 3-year retreat for Westerners, there was inevitably some adaptation just because of who we were. I remember from the very first retreat, though, we were very determined that it be as serious and as close to the Asian model as possible, that it wasn't a watered down version. So there's some kind of understanding for that, as you've expressed as well, wanting it to be, as serious and as real as kind of an Asian retreat. One of the other things that we all grew up within our own communities with certain concepts, and in the Kaiju world, it's so monastic based that the separate cloistered model is what we are aware of and know. And so other traditions have co-ed retreats. And so, but for us, that's a bit of a shock, as you say, and then for a couple to not necessarily have that space to kind of be a bit free of that complexity. Mm-hmm. But then having to adapt to the reality of the situation is very interesting. And so, I mean, there's a couple of things about your experience being a couple as one element. The other is your having studied Tibetan before, and how important that was for you, and how important do you think that is for people going into retreat, as more and more people are able to do retreat in English or in their own languages. Obviously, there's advantages and disadvantages in both sides, but what are your thoughts on some of that?
It was very interesting that, as I mentioned, we already had that sort of coupledoms thing front and center. And one of the first things I think is fairly common across retreat centers, one of the first things is you don't know what room you're in. You're not even supposed to be attached to a space. So one of the first things you do, of course, is you have to go and we pick numbers for room assignments. And guess who ends up being my next door neighbor? And so there was this thing and there was a thread throughout retreat of just the kind of thing you have resistance to is what magically gets presented. So that's another sort of very soft, gentle, sort of grandmotherly way that the lineage says, well, you might want to let go of that, dear. And there were things like that all the time. We picked lots for who was the first trip-in or offering master and the first trip-in assistant. And guess who we got for that assignment? So there were things like that happened all of the time, and definitely contributed to the sense of appreciating his being there. And then really realizing, I think if you had asked me ahead of time, wouldn't it be nice? Wouldn't there be good things that came out of Zopa being in retreat, I would have said, yeah, sure, there must be. But there really are some incredibly deep fruits of having spent such an unusual time with your life partner together in that space, which is really hard to duplicate. And then also hard to duplicate is being able to do the retreat with the knowledge of Tibetan. It's wonderful that it's more accessible in our native languages, or for some folks who possibly do retreat in English when it might be their second language, it's still a little more accessible than Tibetan. I think that's wonderful. But I would rather personally have had the knowledge of Tibetan that we had in retreat. Even before I learned to speak or understand Tibetan, I appreciated chanting in Tibetan. There's something about the syllabic structure of Tibetan that makes the chanting flow very smoothly and work very nicely. I feel like it has some subtle body resonance that is valuable for practice. Just the richness of knowing how many wonderful beings who have attained realization using these exact words coming through your vocal cords is very, very positive. We also had very extensive studies in how to read text, how to parse the material. And it just so happens that our teachers at Pulahari, Khenpo Lodja Namgyal Rinpoche, and Khenpo Sherab, Khenpo Chökyi Gyaltsen, they had just published a series of retreat manuals in Tibetan for the Kagyu retreat. And literally, I don't know how they managed this, because, mail from India is not the most reliable thing to begin with, but we received 4 full sets of it on the day that retreat started. This enormous box landed, one for each of us, one for the center and one for our retreat master. So we actually had the ancient texts that had the descriptions and commentaries of the practices, far more than you actually do in retreat. So that also was very helpful. We were able to translate pieces of that to help others as well. So it's hard to duplicate that kind of depth that you get if you're able to learn the Tibetan. But even if it's just the sound, I personally found that it was really beneficial to do the Tibetan, and it was also beneficial at times to be able to fall back into the English translations. We had a full set and that was only Tibetan, but we also had the set that the center was making available for everyone that had the English translation. And I would also use the English, even though I could use the Tibetan.
So you got your program was the Kamikaju program in retreat?
Yes, it was a consonant.
So maybe for people that are not familiar, you can just describe what a daily schedule looked like, and a little bit of how the practice schedule unfolded.
Yeah, so we it morphs a little bit over time as several of the practices kind of ramp up or get added in terms of some of the daily practices, like Chöd getting added several, I think it was about 2 or 3 months into the practice. But in general, overall, the daily schedule, for the most part, would begin around, officially it would begin at 4:30 in the morning. We were quite keen on being able to make all of the practice numbers for the different idams and things like that, or prostrations, or any of the Ngo-dro practices. So I think for the most part, we would start about 3 or 3:30 most days. And you do your open your shrine, do your first session from about 4:30 to 6. And then there'd be the post-session practices, right? Which, so you'd finish your first session and then you'd usually jump right into doing the water torma, generosity offering practice, and the and the Riwo Sangchu, the Mountain of Burnt Offerings, and that, and then also whatever else as practice went on, some of our daily commitment practices that we had to do. Then we'd have breakfasts, I think from 7 to 8, and as well as, since there were so few of us, there was only 4 of us. Initially, there was 5 of us. One person had to leave about 7 months in, something like that. So we would we also had cleaning duties and things like that would rotate. And then our next practice period would be from 8 to 11, and then we'd have a break. But again, usually that period of practice would run over doing these are our individual practices in our rooms. Then we'd have a break and lunch, and then have the third afternoon practice from, I think it was about 1:30 to 3:30, I believe. And then we'd have the group Mahakala practice and Serchu offerings in the later afternoon, followed by a break and dinner, and then again an individual evening practice, followed by the Chöd practice. So most days it was probably going from about 3:30 till 10, 3:30 in the morning till about 10.
So you had one group practice per day for the Mahakala Puja, so you didn't have a morning group practice?
No, we didn't have. Normally there's a Green Tara practice in the morning, but Khenpo Jigme felt like the 2 group practices were, the one group practice was a lot for folks to handle, and that to have 2 would be just too much. Some of the offsite people who were local were trying to attend the group practice as well, but were feeling frustrated if they couldn't make it. So having 2 of them felt like it would be harder for everyone.
Especially with a smaller number of people in retreat, then all of the kind of doing the rituals is a lot of work as well.
Yeah, for sure. And that, those, I vividly remember, those first 6 months or so of getting used to, because you have to learn the melody for Mahakala and all the chipin, the shrine keeper duties and things like that. It's the music, which we were not very good at, and that was not part of our preparation beforehand. We had a lot of philosophical preparation, but not much ritual preparation.
All of which was absolutely useless in learning how to play the cymbals.
In preparation for the very first retreat, we were learning the Jialing in the French countryside. And we only found out later that we go behind the retreat center looking out over these bucolic fields. And it was only later that we found that our attempts at learning the Jialing had turned all of the cows in this dairy region into non-productivity.
Oh, no.
So the music is quite a challenge. And you mentioned sleeping, so you also had slept sitting up in the traditional way, the meditation boxes, as we say.
Yeah. So we were fortunate. We had my stepfather actually built us each meditation box, kind of. And we were able to bring them home afterwards, so we still have them here in our shrine room. We don't sleep in them anymore.
You're right here.
But yeah. So I think there's a lot of 3-year retreat feels like it's kind of pushing you to the edge and beyond, and just helping one not make such a big deal out of it, be able to be a little bit more comfortable with the chaos of life and everything happening, and maintain that thread of bodhicitta. So it feels like that's kind of one of the many ways that the 3-year retreat kind of instructs us both explicitly and implicitly.
And also that it takes a while to get used to the sleeplessness, because it's not just sleeping, and you have to explain to people what it means to sleep in a box, because people imagine, like a cat sitting in an Amazon box or something. It's not like that. It's a chair, but it's square, and the word in Tibetan is box, so it tends to be called that. But it's awkward sleeping in any number of odd positions you put yourself into. Sleep upright or something that's a semblance of upright. And then on top of that, the schedule is also not what we normally keep to. And the intensity of the practice is also not something, it's unusual to have all of those things happening just suddenly in our lives. And retreat starts out that way. So it starts out with, this very embodied challenge of not getting enough sleep and feeling tired. And there's a 1 week of protector practice, Vajrakalaya practice at first, but then you're right in the Ngo-dro. And going back to what we talked about before in pre-retreat training, I really could not stress enough the importance of having done Ngo-dro ahead of time, because it's the very first practice. It used to be that people had to have completed at least a Ngo-dro to go into retreat, but that's less and less happening. But if there's a lot that you learn about yourself as a practitioner doing Ngo-dro, and just a simple knowing what to expect kind of thing. And it's the first 6 months of practice. That's pretty considerable, and it's a big relief. In the middle of not getting enough sleep and having this awkward chair that you're living in, basically. You're not just sleeping in it, but except for food, which you might choose to take to your room, all of your practice is happening there. If you're reading and studying on the practices between sessions, there's really no other place in the room to do it. So it's kind of your place to live. And to have a practice like Ngo-dro that feels familiar and that you can slide right into, like basically hit the ground running, made a big difference at the beginning. Otherwise, it can be very discouraging from the get-go. And that's not a great feeling from the start.
I mean, often people hear these kinds of stories and they think of the rigor, the physical challenges and the rigors as being what's difficult. But in fact, I think most people come out of retreat saying, well, all of that we adapt, all of that we learn actually quite easily. What's is sitting facing our own mind day in, day out, month in, month out.
Yeah, I often heard that retreat was very much about getting along with other people. But I think it's exactly as you said, it's about getting along with your mind. In the midst of challenge, whether it comes from other people or sleeplessness or doubting ourselves or whatever it may be, just getting along with our mind. And as Drupal Kempo, our teacher at Pulari, advised us, is learning how not to get tangled up in all of the kleshas that come up, because of all of there's a gazillion reasons every single day for kleshas to come and tempt us with their ways. And getting to know our mind well enough to do what we can, whether we're tangled up in them or not, is so much of a part of it. You're absolutely right.
And I think also the just that piece of how the structure helps us, how the structure supports you. Like we often talk about, like, what a relief it, not at first, it takes a bit to get used to it, but what a relief it is not to have to decide what I'm going to do today. There's the sense of like, oh, I've got a lot to do in terms of the practice, making tormas, for example, learning new practice, all of these different things. But at the same time, it's not like our daily life where it's like, oh, when am I going to eat? When am I going to eat? Where am I going to go today? When am I going to do the shopping? Am I going to take this vacation that I want? It's just like, oh, I know what I'm doing. And there's such a freedom in that structure that really allows one to delve deeply internally, I think. So that was one of the things I think that we both really appreciated about 3-year retreat.
you've alluded to how full the day is with the actual practice sessions, but then all of the extra practices that are done between sessions. And a lot of people coming out of retreat talk about how we see how inefficient we are in our lives. That by using every minute, so that in the few free moments of the day, we have to do the ordinary things that we often have a lot of time to take care of. So we learn how to be very efficient with our time.
Yeah. And that, in some ways, that reminds me a lot of, we got advice, we told Chödrön Rinpoche, who we had teachings from before, that we were going to 3-year retreat. And that was one of the things that she said to us in a private interview very shortly before we went, which was just like, oh, now you'll get a taste. 3-year retreat is just a little taste of what it is like to walk the Bodhisattva path.
Wow.
Yeah. And it was,
which I think is, oh, sorry, go ahead, Yeshe.
Go ahead.
Which I think is exactly just that, is that sense of like being fully committed, using all your time wisely towards the Dharma. And it feels like 3-year retreat is the structure that almost like trains you to be able to do that, trains you to use time more wisely for the Dharma and supports you in it.
And just the fulfillment at the end of a day of, wow, that was a day well lived. There's never a sense of, oh man, I really wasted my time today. And on top of all of that, we were also preparing when Khenpo Jigme was teaching. He can speak English, he can do it colloquially, and he can teach, but he's still more comfortable. There's a lot of language, and they're really taught very rigorously with language. He's still more comfortable teaching in Tibetan, so we would often have to be preparing to translate for teaching. So that added another dimension. But then there's another piece which always gets me very emotional, which is just how many people are involved in giving us that freedom to devote ourselves to practice. We had 2 magnificent practitioners who were cooks in our retreat, and then later a third. Sundru and Anthony were just remarkable. They were constant supports and friends, and their practice of cooking for us was really a practice. Khenpo Jigme and Khenpo Lobsang lived in the retreat and dealt with all of the ebbs and flows of difficulties and joys that comes of that. And they gave of themselves completely. There was never a moment where there was even a flash of hesitation from them. Anything anybody needed, they were there for that. And there was support people, managers at the retreat, folks in the community who were giving up access to the center for all that time. Not to mention, of course, Kyabje Trungpa Rinpoche, who made the entire thing possible. Folks like Sadra Foundation, who supported the retreatants with contemplative scholarships. Just such a web of people whose generosity and kindness makes it possible for you to not think about, where is the food coming from? What am I going to do? How am I going to pay the rent? All of that other stuff.
So I'm just curious, and of course, through retreat, you go through a whole range of different practices. Were there specific practices or moments in the retreat that were just real highlights that you think back on, or remember, or still you carry with you?
I mean, truthfully, I feel like there was so many. It's such a rich experience. But like some of the one for me that like jumps out the most, I think, would be doing when we had finished towards the end of Demchok of Chakra Samvara practice, which was like the second main yidam that we did in our cycle. We would do the jinsek, the actual fire puja burnt offering, which is, again, super intense, very, there's a lot to learn. It's ongoing. There's a lot of preparation for it, but getting to be the main one doing it, we would do it as as a community doing the Jinsek offering. And this again ties back into the importance of knowing some Tibetan, because like Yeshe and I could follow along because we could read Tibetan well enough. Some of the other retreatants couldn't, and this was the Jinsek practice we didn't have a translated copy, wasn't available. So but just getting to be outdoors after this very intense period of 5 or 6 months of doing chakra samvara, and really having been grounded in the visualization throughout the whole practice, and then getting to be outside, be the Dorje Lopen. Like I was a Dorje Lopen for that. Yeshe was acting as the shrine keeper, and there's a lot of offerings involved, and it just felt, and Khenpo Jigme was being the Umze leading it, so it just felt there was something really magical about being outdoors in the snow. It was cold, it's a long practice, but you got the fire and you're chanting, and that felt like super magical for me. So that's one for me that stood out.
Yeah, there were several things again that stood out for me, but I think the one that to this day still hits me is possibly because it's the first, or possibly because it's such a central yidam for the lineage, but the Vajrayogini practice was just so unimaginably profound for me. And there's also a lot even more structure and boundary in the Vajrayogini practice. There's all kinds of physical restraints that you're under, and silence, observing full silence, even more strict cloister boundary. But because it was the first long yidam practice, it was about a year in. By that time, we'd done Nunjo and several guru yoga practices, a Conchuchido practice, but it was the first really long one. It was 6 months for the various exoteric, esoteric, and mystical stages. The accumulation of mantras was just astronomical. But there was something about that time that just felt so intimate and so internal. And it was the beginning. It wasn't like I wasn't involved in the practices before then. I certainly was, but I still had that sort of success drive habit going before then. Whereas Vajrayogini for me is where the retreat shifted, and it became, I was doing other things between breaks, but it was almost like a call to come back to the box and to the shrine. And it was just this magical pull to come back to this space where you can give yourself to the practice with wonder and just not have any idea what's coming of it. And every day be just a joy and a delight. And that completely just changed the course of the retreat feel for me for the rest of the practices. But then throughout, I think one thing I'd be really remiss not to mention is just the closeness of the one-to-one connection with either Khenpo Jigme or Khenpo Lobsang throughout the retreat. That one-to-one ear-whispered kind of teaching, so central to the Kagyu lineage, which we'd had a very strong taste of from Drupal Khenpo and Boko Rinpoche, and Khenpo Chökyi and Kalahari and in Merrick, to have that continue into 3-year retreat, and to be able to have someone with whom we could return and really speak about things that happen in practice or questions we might have, and have that ongoing, very individualized conversation with a teacher was just incredible. I can't imagine how you have that outside of that setting. It would be very difficult to contrive.
And there's a couple more too that I'd add, just because. Thanks so much. I think the also doing, later on when we did like an inscription purification ritual for the deceased, that felt quite powerful, and at that time there had been like a close family friend who was like my childhood doctor, who I had heard through a letter had passed away, and so just like getting to do, you know, the extensive inscription ritual for him felt quite moving, in the sense, you know, that's later on in the third year, and so it feeling very grounded and in the ritual, having a handle on the ritual, and at the same time learning, because each ritual is different, but it just felt so powerful to be able to do something like that for people that we love that have died, or so there was that. And then also doing Kempo Jigme also really supported us during the Chöd intensive practice that we did. So the two of us with Kempo Jigme got to do like the Chöd soak offering, which again is a fully new practice, but he was so supportive, and he would call up his friends in Bhutan like who's an umse, to get the different melodies of the different pieces of the practice and record them, and so just that, again, that sense of being so supported in doing the practice.
So that was the longer Chö, right?
Yeah.
And then there's that exquisite longer Chö that is done at the end of retreats.
Yeah. And I mean, that, to me, that just, I think of those periods as really feeling like that's the time that I have felt most alive and like most present, is like being really deep in the ritual, being very grounded, and it's so powerful.
So did you guys have a chance to learn the Trilcore exercises with the 6 yogas? So how did you manage that in the building? Did you have an outside place to do that, or?
No, so for the Trilcore exercises, Kempo Jigme, it had been a long time since he had done them. Kempo Lobsang hadn't done 3-year retreat, so he hadn't practiced them. But fortunately, Tugu Damchu had come to give us some teachings and some empowerments, and his attendant had finished 3-year retreat, I think, fairly recently, like 4 or 5 years prior. So he taught us while they were there for the couple weeks. Kempo Jigme had asked him to teach us, so we got to do those the practices, and we got to do them just in the main shrine room. Like we bought some yoga, some like exercise mats that we got to use, and and it took a bit of like experimentation for sure, like trying to work out what happened. So I don't, in some ways I feel like maybe we didn't get the full Trilcore experience, just because they were our teacher for Trilcore was only there for a couple weeks, and so we had to, and he didn't speak English very well, and so and my Tibetan in terms of like physical things is not up to par in that way, but we worked it out enough.
The Trilcore for the narrow Trilcore is also got richer, more complex, with actually visualizations for each exercises. So in the Shampa tradition, it's a little more rigorous, but it's simpler. But it takes time to learn. So yeah, I can understand the challenge of being taught that without someone who has time to spend.
It would have been great to have someone there more long term to kind of help us, but we did get to do it. We, in general, in terms of our schedule, we would do it. I think we had like a 40, once we got to that part, we had like a 45-minute practice period after Mahakala and Serchu in the afternoon to do it before dinner.
And we did have those retreat manuals that Rigved Dorje Publications had sent us from Pulahari. Had a lot of detailed and images, and that was a big support as well. Recently, Kalo Rinpoche was just here in Santa Fe, and he's been teaching some of the Niguma yogas to folks, and Zopa was able to get more instruction from him. And Rinpoche has asked him to continue leading the group with those, because it was a very particular interest of Zopa's in 3-year retreat. So I'm glad to see that continuing.
So then let's move on to coming out of retreat. So how was that for you? And I mean, that your home is not that far away, but how did you handle the transition? Often that's the most challenging for people, the kind of coming out of retreat and post-retreat.
It was, Zopa mentioned the post-death practices and inscription rituals that we were doing right at the end. That would have been in January of 2016, and we came out of retreat in May. Trungpa Rinpoche came to open the retreat. And my stepfather had passed away also that January. And so during the practices of Amitabha and Poa and the purification, I'd been keeping him going through daily practice. But to my mom, I knew was really heavily grieving still. And it was very difficult for me I'd always thought of myself as the person who supports my mom through anything. So to be away from her during that time was extremely difficult for me. Again, Khenpo Jigme, as usual, never fails. And he was extremely supportive and giving me advice on what daily practices to do, on how to work with my mom and my family, how to deal with that. So by the time the retreat opening ceremony came, our family was coming. One of the first things that happened is we had completed the practices in early May, but the opening ceremony was on Sakadawa Duchen because of the auspiciousness. So we had 2 or 3 weeks there, and Khenpo Jigme very wisely said, okay, start leaving the boundaries of the retreat and, go up to the stupa or wherever you might encounter people, that's fine, but start getting used to that. But then another thing we realized is that, first of all, we're not the only ones in retreat. Our entire family was cloistered from us. They could write to us, but we would get mail once a month, and without fail, I had a letter every week from my mom. I have a whole stack of weekly letters from her throughout the entire time. But we decided that our moms were especially vulnerable to coming to a ceremony and then seeing us for the first time in 3 years in a crowd of people. So we were able to arrange to meet our moms, our 2 moms, before the opening ceremony, which was very good. Khalees, my mother-in-law, Zopa's mom, was very kind to take care of my mom when she was really sad and vulnerable during that time. So that was the first thing, is just sort of returning to the mother in the space of outside of a retreat. And then, of course, the ceremony came, and we realized that, of all the people, our moms were pretty good by then. They'd seen us and they were doing well, but Zopa's father was sobbing throughout the entire ceremony, and my brother was emotional. Our additional mothers and fathers who came to us. So a lot of it was just sort of reconnecting with family at first. But then the kinds of things you hear about all the time, just getting used to being back in ordinary life, simple things. So I remember going to dinner the night of the ceremony. It was the first time we'd been at a restaurant, and we had a whole bunch of folks, all of our family and friends, and cooks from the retreat, and they gave us this huge menu, and I just looked at it and I was like, so I asked our cook to choose for me. But he wouldn't. He said to suck it up and do it myself. But it was kind of like that. It was sort of like getting used to not having that soft space where you can be very vulnerable and very like skinless almost. And it did take some getting used to. One of the things, I don't know if it changed while we were in retreat, or I just never noticed before, is I would go to the grocery store for just a simple grocery run, and I felt like everywhere we went there was like loud music playing, and it was just physically uncomfortable. So I would have to come back and just like rest for an hour after a 15-minute grocery run, or simple things like just not gauging time properly, which you don't think of as a big deal. But when you're driving, you're mostly gauging time. Am I going to get through this intersection on my left turn before this other person in their car hits me? So it took me several months before I felt comfortable driving. So there were some like weird things like that I never would have thought of. But then definitely just learning to what the rhythm of sustaining those practices would be in a setting that doesn't have everything taken care of for you. To what extent can you do that? I've come to think of retreat more than anything as something that creates, living containers for these practices that then go out into the world. And to whatever extent we've been able to do these practices, they're alive in our mind. And to some extent, we have to find a way to continue that. And that's a challenge. That's an interesting thing, and not knowing how we'll be called to serve the Dharma in different ways.
I think you allude to something that is important in terms of understanding retreat. We talked about the retreat providing a space where we can be vulnerable. Right? It's really a sanctuary, rather than being locked up, locked away, cloistered. All of the concepts we have of going in retreat in terms of the separation from the world we know, it's really a gift of sanctuary where we can allow ourselves to let all the defenses fall away and to be very vulnerable and to do that deep work.
Yeah. And even I so vividly remember, and I can still feel it, just like, especially like going back into one's own room, into the box, like, and especially our longest session was like that 8 to 11 session in the morning. And so like after breakfast, especially later on in the retreat, it just felt like such a sanctuary, such just like, oh, this is great. I have this expansive time to just do this practice and really settle in. So yeah, it is such a support in that way.
So since you've come out, I mean, you obviously have started teaching, have your activity. And so what are your thoughts about, how you're trying to adapt the Dharma, or to make it more accessible, or to respect the tradition while adapting to the modern world? Do you have thoughts on that?
We have lots of thoughts on that. But, well, I think one of the things I would say is it was also helpful because we had been teaching somewhat before, because Pulahari had asked us to help with the program there. And when they first asked us, we didn't think they meant teaching and translating. We thought they meant like showing people where the bathrooms were. So that was like surprise to us, so it's like thrown into the fire before. But so I think that certainly was helpful, having had that experience even before 3-year retreat, and then coming out. I think for both of us, I'll let Yeshe speak to it too for herself, but certainly for me, I certainly feel such a deep trust in the lineage, in the wisdom of these teachings, in that have come through, that for me it's quite important as much as possible to just be a conduit for what feels helpful, and part of that I feel like is helping us as Westerners unpack a lot, both like cultural baggage and assumptions that we bring to the teachings, and so a lot of the work we do still involves Tibetan and the language itself, because I think there is a lot of assumptions that we bring to Dharma that aren't necessarily part of Dharma, that can make a really big impact on people's path. So I think that's a large part of what we still try to incorporate into our teachings, because it to me, it really does feel like the teachings in many ways are perfect, are complete. And it's just a matter of like, how do we help people engage with that completeness through all the layers of assumption, resistance, or cultural trapping. Some of it is cultural trappings, I think, but I think there's we tend to see a little bit more of the what we call like cultural chauvinism sometimes that comes from the West towards the teachings, in terms of thinking like, oh, we're so much more educated, we can come to the teachings with, to almost again as like this Western savior kind of complex, like we know better. And so I think everyone has a different way of doing it, but both the way that we were taught by Drupal Kempo and Bokar Rinpoche before retreat, and then also our retreat experiences are such that it feels like really relying on the teaching, really delving into the teaching in ways that are true to it, and not taking for granted that emptiness or karma or any of these, or renunciation, some of our favorite terms to work with, are the way that we assume when we first hear it.
Yeah, and I think another big piece of it is just helping people learn to engage the Dharma as directly as possible. It's very helpful if you know Tibetan and Tibetan Buddhism, or Japanese and Zen, or whatever it may be, Chinese and Chan, etc., Pali and the Theravadan tradition. But as directly as we can encounter it, and really just engage. The monastic college system is very heavily grounded in listening, contemplating, and meditating on the teachings, which gives you a real dialogue, a personal dialogue with those teachings. And they come alive and you meet them in the places of friction for you. And a lot of what we do is sort of help people to see that there's something wrong with those frictions. It's not an indicator that we should chuck that out. It's an indicator of some juicy conversations to have with the Buddha about these things, and in contemplation and meditation. And it's a wonder when we go there where that can lead, without disparaging any of the teachings and any of the heritage of Buddhism throughout Asia. But seeing them as an invitation to come closer and to examine not just the teachings, but our own assumptions, and where do they come from? And, what can I learn from that clash that actually helps to open me up more instead of shutting me down? And a lot of what we do is about that, creating a fluency and an empowerment. It really is a kind of empowerment, because I'm not sure that our culture really trains us to have that active and engagement with spiritual traditions. It's not that Western spiritual traditions don't have that, but even in Asia, lay folks don't necessarily have the same access as the priests in Catholicism, or the lamas in Tibet, or the monks in Theravada, or whatever it may be, the more privileged spiritual classes. But it's definitely changed over time, and it's certainly changing as it leaves Asia. But even in Asia nowadays, folks have a much more enhanced access to the teachings than they have in the past. And there's an empowerment that really is vital to sort of allow us to step up and say, hey, I'm not so sure about this. And instead of just shutting down or shutting out the teaching, have that be a portal to going deeper into understanding ourselves, understanding the Dharma, and coming into greater intimacy with the Buddha and his teachings and what he wants for us. Again, learning to trust just enough to make that step forward, one simple step forward, and see where that takes you, and then keep going. And as you mentioned, I think one of retreat's invaluable aspects is that ease with vulnerability that you learn when so many people are holding you up and allowing them. Basically, they're the boundaries that are keeping everything away, so that you can be vulnerable. And then it's not comfortable in retreat for any number of reasons, but you do learn that comfort with vulnerability, and you can take that out. And I think if there's anything that I would like to do in the various teaching work we do is to allow people to drop the defenses, drop the assumptions, drop the various privileges that we have, the various racial issues that we have, societal issues that we have, and be as naked as possible when we encounter the Dharma, so that we can absorb as much as possible, just as it is.
Well, I think that's maybe a perfect place to stop. This has really been very rich and fun, and I thank you both very much for
Thanks to you.
conversation.
And thanks,
you.
of course, again to Chödrön Foundation for all they've done for us, but more importantly for so many others individually and collectively. The Dharma is so much stronger because of Chödrön's input.
Thank you both.
Thank you.